In addition to Trevor Noah's video, there's an archive video years ago from Weird History about Cleveland's 10-cent beer night. Now, the reason why that's relevant, the reason why I referenced it will be clear here in a moment. The other video that has most informed me to develop my opinion is the Washington Post minute-by-minute account of the events of the, I'm going to call it a murder, but it's an alleged murder at this one, a charge of a crime of murder. I will call it a murder, which I believe it is. The 10-cent beer night is relevant because within that video, it talks about the climate in Cleveland that led up to this horrific night of drunkenness in the Cleveland Stadium for, I believe, a baseball game. The crimes committed against the players, the crimes committed against the referees, literally showered with glass bottles, many injuries. Don't think there were any deaths that night, but there were crimes committed, many crimes committed, probably few, if any, prosecutions, because the bottles were coming from crowds of people and prosecutions would have been very difficult. My point is, the setup to, which Weird History does very well, talked about the economic and social changes that were happening within Cleveland at the time. The layoffs of the steel industry did not create drunken anarchy in the baseball stadium of Cleveland, yet they were very much linked. So to try to detach the drunkenness in the Cleveland Stadium from the layoffs in the steel mills, you just can't. They are Weird History. By history, they link them. And that's exactly what will happen in the murder of George Floyd. Whether we want to believe the violent protests are part of the killing, we want to make them separate. We want to think peaceful processes were tied to the justice for George, and somehow the violent protests, the criminal protests, the looting, the murders, I believe, the arson is somehow, that's something else entirely. It's not. History will link them. And I think 10-Cent Beer Night by Weird History does a very good job of saying, take the same kind of thing, the lead up to the events, look at how they are linked forever, and the same thing will be true for George Floyd, whether we like it or not. Trevor then goes on to Amy Cooper. Trevor doesn't talk about 10-Cent Beer Night. That's my link. Trevor starts with Amy Cooper, and what he said, in ways I wish I could say as well, is that Amy Cooper, he used the word powerful. That moment where she picked up the phone to call 911, prior to that warning, I will call EMS, I will tell them my life is being threatened by an African-American man. The power of that phone in her hand as a white woman, threatening to say that her life is being threatened, along with the threat of her dog. Now listen, as a New Jersey, New York person, I know firsthand the sensitivity of hurting someone's dog. This, for her to weaponize the threat of her dog's life and the threat of her life as a white woman, as a dog in New York, to know the power of that charge against a black man in Central Park, oftentimes people claim, we just don't understand racism. Trevor's point is it was powerful. Amy, in that moment, in a 5-minute video that went viral, Amy knows racism. She knows the disparity of power. She knows that call to EMS will not necessarily go her way, but she has very good reason to believe that somehow the other Cooper, I believe his name was Christian Cooper, the bird watcher, the black man who was accused of threatening Amy's life and the life of her dog, fraudulent claim. As Trevor says, it's a powerful moment because it illustrates just how clear Amy understands racism. And any claim that people don't understand racism and the disparity of power, it picks up very clearly in that video. Now, Trevor also talks about the lockdown and how that is sort of a foreshadowing event into Floyd's event. I will say what I think Trevor says briefly, but maybe not as well as I'll say it now, or emphasize it, is that the events were on the same day. I've gone back to verify that. When the videos went viral, I think it was only about 5 hours apart. So the Amy Cooper video was quickly overshadowed by Chauvin's murder of George Floyd. From George Floyd's video, tying it to the Washington Post, the Washington Post went through minute by minute, and that is in my blog. I'm not going to talk about it very much here, other than, again, this is a point from Trevor, how calm Chauvin is while he chokes a man to death. We those who watched it, which includes just about every person who has a cell phone on the planet or has a friend with a cell phone on the planet, has watched that video. We watched a man viciously kill another man because he could, while he remained calm. He could have talked logically while he committed this heinous act. The minute by minute, which is documented in my blog, which I extracted from the Washington Post. Again, a review of my blog is going to be 2 or 3 minutes. Watching the Washington Post is about 11 minutes. But what it shows is many things. Chauvin is not the one who cuffed Floyd. Chauvin is the one who arrived and within like a minute and 20 seconds has his knee on Floyd's neck. So the man's already cuffed. Chauvin shows up a minute 20 seconds later, Chauvin has his knee on the neck. Now that's where I think the justification for first-degree manslaughter should be found, because that the two men, the deceased and the perpetrator, Chauvin, are said to have prior interaction. And it's, in my assessment, Chauvin showed up and thought, there's the man, I'll get him now. That's the premeditation that supports first degree, is the way I understand it. I'm just glad I applaud, I celebrate this second degree charge. The protests, the arson, the looting, the vandalism, the theft, the murder / manslaughter. I don't know that out of these violent protests, the ones that turned criminal, that anyone's been accused of murder, but certainly people have been killed defending their store, and what kind of charges come out of that is yet to be seen. So I called it murder / manslaughter. People are dead as a process of the protests that flipped into criminal. People are trying to separate the peaceful protests from the criminal activity linked to protests, but history will link them together. And this is why it's so nice for me to go back to 10-cent beer night, because this is an event of decades ago that Weird History did maybe a couple years ago. And you cannot tell the story of 10-cent beer night without understanding the foreshadowing events of the economic, the layoffs, the steel mills of Cleveland. So history will link, no matter how much we want them to be separate, history will link them together. Here's how they're different. Here's how the murder of George Floyd is different from the protests that went criminal. Number one, they're linked whether we like it or not. Number two, the crimes of the protests, the thousands arrested. In my opinion, there's a good chance the arsonists will be found. Certainly not everyone that stole or damaged, vandalized merchandise, broke the windows will be prosecuted, but some will be. That those crimes are part of a justice system that is functioning. But when you look at Derek Chauvin with his knee on the soon-to-die George Floyd, without the circumstances surrounding it, without the Philando Castile, without Eric Gardner, without the building rage for good reason, without Tamir Rice, without, I wish I could think of the man who was shot in the back, because I think that cop was prosecuted, successfully prosecuted and imprisoned. He's the one that, it was a traffic stop, and the black man, unarmed black man, was a driver and ran and was shot in the back. I wish I knew that man's name, but I forgot. Those are all foreshadowing events. They are evidence of a malfunctioning or an absence of justice. It's not an absence of justice. Some people have been charged, but certainly it is weak or malfunctioning or no justice in these situations. My point is that brutal, cold-blooded murder of George Floyd by Chauvin, former Officer Chardon, that could go unprosecuted if it weren't for these foreshadowing events, the building rage, the use of amateur cell phone cameras, the use of security footage. It is likely that Chauvin would have gotten away with murder, and God forbid he gets away with murder. So I think that summarizes my points. Listeners, if you made it this far, I would just ask that if you care this much about what I had to say, if you could watch 10 Cent Beer Night on Weird History and sift through the Trevor Noah videos and find this one where he talks about, it would have been 2 days after the videos went viral, because the protest Trevor did this on the day that followed the looting and the burning of Target. I'm not sure if Target was burned, but there were many buildings that were burned in Minneapolis, and the Target had been vandalized and looted the night before. That's when Trevor did this video, which was just brilliant. I see a lot of anger about the looting. I see a lot of people trying to say the looting's not part of what I feel. Now go back to 10 Cent Beer Night and realize that they cannot be separated. I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't. It'd be nice if we could say, oh, the looting was really a completely different thing. It was white fraternity boys in Hoboken. That's a nice thing to blame things on around here. People want to believe they're separate. They're not. And the reason why the Chauvin killing of Floyd is a justified source of rage that the violent protests have reason to trigger less rage is because the prosecutions against the looters, the arsons, the murder manslaughters, the thieves, the vandals, some of those people will be prosecuted. And probably pretty easy. Hannah and I watched a video of one guy who videoed himself in Bloomingdale's. Bloomingdale's is Hannah's former employer, and this came to her through a handful of people who had found it. And Hannah was able to see her former workplace getting looted in this video by a man who was celebrating himself looting in the video. The police choose to prosecute him. He has created his own court-worthy, conclusive evidence that has a chance to bring a successful prosecution against him. And for that matter, probably a guilty plea without a prosecution. My point is this. Some people will be charged effectively. Arson, maybe murder, manslaughter. It depends on how much the value is to what they stole. But certainly vandalism, arson, theft, whether it's the higher theft because it's a higher dollar value or the lower, doesn't matter. I can't judge, but there is a functioning functioning system of justice that will charge and get convictions on a lot of the 1,000 people who have been arrested. We have abundant evidence of a weak or absent system of justice against murders like Chauvin against George Floyd. This has been Tom Duty, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Duty in a Google search from my site. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, good evening, or restful night's sleep. Ciao.